Hello, everybody, and welcome in the room here at the DIW and online as well. In the name of the German Institute for Economic Research, the DIW Berlin, and the Research Institute for Sustainability Helmholtz-Zentrum Potsdam, in short RIFS, I'm very pleased to welcome you to the panel discussion Narrating for New Narratives, Scientific Podcasts for Sustainability Transformations, which is part of the Berlin Science Week. My name is Alexandra Toast, and I work as a research associate at the RIFS. Although our society disposes of more information than ever, we are in the midst of a deepening ecological and civilizational catastrophe. Apart from wars with unseen civilian death tolls, a headline today was that according to the data of EU scientists and the World Climate Council, IPCC, 2023 has been declared as the hottest year of the last 125,000 years. This has been reflected in horrible events such as floods, heat waves, and wildfires that have caused thousands of deaths. The need for transformations is evident. At the same time, we observe an incredible growth in the numbers of podcasts. Podcasts are interesting for transformations, since they offer the opportunity to contribute to telling different stories than the ones that are seen in mainstream media, exploring alternatives to the status quo. By narrating their stories, they can contribute to understanding our world in crises and to creating new narratives that are needed for changing directions. So we created this event to discuss the contributions of social and sustainability scientists to this booming sector. Now I'm looking forward to an exciting panel discussions with wonderful guests. But first we want to start with an opening message by Henning Krause. Henning is social media manager in the head office of the Helmholtz Association. Helmholtz is Germany's largest research organization. I would say, as a pioneer in that area, Henning founded 2 German language science communication podcasts. In 2010, Raumzeit, established at the German Aerospace Center, and 3 years later, Resonator, the Helmholtz Research Podcast. He is also part of the voluntary project Wissenschaftspodcast.de. Thank you for being here, Henning.
Thanks. Dear podcasters, dear guests, the title of this event, Narrating for New Narratives, Scientific Podcast for Sustainability Transformations. In this panel discussion, you will learn a lot about suitable narratives and good storytelling in science podcasts. In my opening statement, I would like to go to the meta level of sustainability podcasts for a few minutes. I want to talk about the sustainability of podcasts themselves and the dangers of platformizing podcasts. I am the editor and project manager behind the German language Resonator podcast at the Helmholtz Association. This audio podcast has been around since 2013. This was 3 years before Spotify even started their podcast service. We have now published 200 episodes at Resonator. That's more than a week of listening material and more than 5 million downloads. Above all, there are tens of thousands of bonds with people, with listeners who give us around 1 hour of their attention every month. And in the following, I would like to reflect on how these connections are technically created and ensured. As a person with a severe podcast addiction, I listen to a lot of podcasts and I recommend a lot of podcasts to other people. In personal conversations until a few years ago, we searched for the podcast websites on the smartphones of my conversation partners. I then explained to the podcast newbies how they could install a podcast app. But in the last 5 years or so, my conversation partners automatically open their Spotify app on their device in order to search for the recommended podcasts. And many podcast providers also refer almost exclusively to podcast platforms such as Deezer, Audible, or Spotify when promoting their formats. Everywhere where you can find podcasts, it says. But I think this everywhere is a structural problem and unsuitable for us podcasters. Does anybody of you still remember Stitcher, Mixler, or Spreaker? No? They also wanted to become the YouTube for audio, but they don't exist anymore. Alphabet is in the process of shutting down Google Podcasts at the end of this year. The question for us, content providers, in this context should be, why should we become dependent on such intermediaries? The term intermediary hereby refers to a digital platform provider, not only but also social media networks, including podcast platforms. Intermediaries offer a service that can connect content providers and users, but also monetize this very connection. Intermediaries can use algorithmic weighing to control access to content between providers and consumers. In addition, all of the intermediaries that have been successful in the recent years, such as Facebook, Instagram, YouTube, etc., have business models that push barely regulated advertisement into users' timelines, including, unfortunately, false reports, lies, hate speech, and content with group-related misanthropy. We have seen the negative effects of this in the recent years. For example, the Brexit referendum and Trump election in 2016. And even the Facebook scandal surrounding Cambridge Analytica in 2018 has so far changed little in terms of platform use by content providers. Over the past 12 months, we have also been able to track the negative changes to the service now called X. Many organizations are seeing significant drops in reach, not only, but also due to changes to the algorithms. Why should we be dependent on such intermediaries? Why should we make ourselves dependent on their business models and self-interests? Especially us, as publicly funded researchers and science organizations. I keep hearing 4 answers to this question. 1, because of the reach. 2, because the users are there. 3, because that's just how you do it. And 4, the basic attitude, there are other distribution channels than podcast platforms. I have only a short time to address these 4 replies. 1, because of the reach. Yes, of course, but you can also create reach outside of podcast platforms. The Helmholtz resonator, for instance, only has some 3% of its plays on Spotify, while 97% of it is on the free internet, and especially in open podcast apps. Answer 2, because the users are there. Yes, but you can also point out to the listeners within the broadcast that you can also listen to the podcast outside of the platforms. Real podcast apps, for example, also offer added value features such as chapter images. Answer 3, because that's just how you do it. No, I disagree. I also noticed that more and more new podcasts are only being published on Spotify, but as an old-school podcaster, for me, this really is a no-go. Answer number 4, there are other distribution channels than podcast platforms? Yes, there are. A podcast feed that can be accessed freely and publicly without restrictions on the internet. Audio podcasts have emerged as the technical siblings of blogs, which communicated their content via RSS feeds, a cultural technique that has unfortunately not become very widespread, but is indeed very practical, especially for consuming news and podcasts. If you host your podcast yourself or with an open host service such as Podigy, you can offer it to a lot of listeners freely accessible with a podcast feed from your own server. This is comparable to a customer contact without intermediaries via a website visit or an email newsletter. Here too, there is no middleman company that could technically limit the reach or demand money for it, or even insert advertisement into the content. This direct connection to our listeners should be very valuable to us. We should nurture it, and it should be our primary outlet. It also sticks very well with the ideas of openness of science, and it doesn't cost us anything. My conclusion: what doesn't work, in my opinion, is not communicating your own free podcast feed at all, or hiding it at best as possible in the how you can hear us section of your website. Unfortunately, this is exactly what I'm seeing very often with many podcasts on the web. We shouldn't become dependent on intermediaries like Spotify, not from their business models or self-interest, especially we as publicly funded researchers and science organizations. This is incredibly easy, especially with podcasts. Let us use publicly and freely accessible podcast feeds and primarily promote those. Let us point out smartphone podcast apps such as Overcast, Pocket Casts, Podcast Addict, AntennaPod, or even Apple Podcasts in our About text. Here we can have a direct connection to our listeners without a superfluous intermediary in between. In this way, science and sustainability podcasts themselves remain sustainable, connected to their audience. I'm coming to an end here. As mentioned, I often get asked for podcast recommendations. Since my time now here is up, I am not recommending individual podcasts for you to listen to, but rather a website that links many German-language podcasts worth listening to you as a directory. You can find it on the website wissenschaftspodcast.de. Thanks for your attention.
Thank you very much, Henning, for giving us these insights. And I think at least to myself, you convinced me that we should look for alternatives. And that's a very interesting start for speaking about also the contents of the podcast, speaking about what is surrounding them. But before I let you go, I just wanted to take the chance that I have you here on the floor, that you tell us from the Helmholtz perspective, how have you been engaging with podcasts apart from the ones that you are producing? Can you share a little bit your experience there?
So we have the Resonator podcast that I already mentioned. We have also some of our member centers have their own podcasts. The DLR, German Aerospace Center, have their own podcasts, and some others too. Deutsches Zentrum für Neurodegenerative Erkrankungen as well. It's Alzheimer's podcast. And then, of course, podcasts. I think what you learn about podcasts is that people are very much willing to invest a lot of brain time when listening to podcasts, and you have a direct connection in the ear and directly to the brain of people, and this is very suitable for science communication. We saw it with the Drosten podcast in Germany during the Corona pandemic. And regarding your question, we have also a lot of scientists from Helmholtz Association go as experts to different podcast shows, not only in German language but also internationally. And this offers a whole new community to us, and people come to our website, subscribe to our email newsletter, and they tell us, well, I heard of this scientists of yours in this podcast, and so this is a for us, from a communication point of view, very suitable way of spreading the news in communities that didn't know about Helmholtz in beforehand.
Okay. Wonderful. Thank you for sharing your experience.
Thank you.
And thank you for being here. And now we move on to the panel. So I invite the panelists to the stage to take a seat. I have to admit that when I was invited to design this podcast event and find some ideas, I simply invited some of my favorite podcasts that I always listen to. So let me introduce to you the people that we have here on the floor. I will start in the middle with Professor Dr. Claudia Kempfert. She works here at the DIW, where she leads the Department of Energy, Transportation and Environment. She is also professor for energy economics and energy policy at the Leuphana University, and her research focuses on the economic assessment of climate and energy policy strategies. As a reviewer and policy consultant, she is member of numerous sustainability advisory boards and commissions, which include the German Council on the Environment. And she's part of the steering committee of the Club of Rome as well. And apart from regular media appearances in major news outlets, she provides orientation in Kempfert's climate podcast on the public radio station MDR. And next to her, maybe a round of applause for Claudia for being here, for Claudia Kempfert. We have Professor Dr. Alex Demirovic. He's professor of political science and sociology at Goethe University in Frankfurt am Main. He's member of the executive board of the Rosa Luxemburg Foundation, and his fields of work include critical social theory, theory of democracy and state. and he hosts the Rosa Luxemburg Foundation's theory podcast, TLDR, Too Long, Didn't Read. Thank you for being here. Next to him, we have Dr. Cecilia Oliveira. We work together at the Research Institute for Sustainability, Helmholtz-Zentrum Potsdam, the RIFS, where she leads our transdisciplinary research group, Democratic Governance and Eco-Political Transformations. As part of a transdisciplinary case study in the Amazon Basin, her research areas include rights of nature, environmental... Is there a problem with the sound?
Yeah, sorry, we have some interference.
Okay. Or maybe that was because I was leaning on the... Mike? Shall I take that? Okay, maybe that's easier. As part of a transdisciplinary case study, Cecilia Oliveira in the Amazon Basin, her research areas include rights of nature, environmental crises, indigenous activism, knowledge production, populism, and climate policy development. Another area of interest is science communication, aiming to connect art and politics through dialogue forums, documentaries, podcasts, performances, and lectures, and lately also a virtual reality project. She will present her podcast, Carbon Critique, Atmosphere, Politics, and Democracy. And we will start the round of presentation. Welcome, Cecilia. Thank you for being here. And we will have a little round of presentation of the podcast, which we will start with also my colleague from the RIFS, Victoria Lu. She works at the research as a research associate in the research group Regional Sustainability Transformations. As a social scientist and mediator, she's interested in cooperation and participation formats between science, policy, and society, which is also very present in her podcast that she will present, which is in German called Hör mal Lausitz, and I think the English translation is Listen Up Lausitz. Is that correct?
Yeah, maybe. But yeah, we have only a German version of our podcast, so yeah, it's Hör mal Lausitz, but yeah, maybe Listen Up Lausitz. Okay. Lusatia.
Thank you, Lusatia. Right.
Yeah.
Thank you, Victoria, for being here.
Yeah, thank you, Alexandra, for the invitation. And yeah, I'm happy to be here. As Alexandra already said, I'm working as a research associate in a project about the structural change process in Lusatia induced by the coal phase out. And yeah, why did we make a podcast? During one of my first visits in Lusatia, people asked me, why is a research institute from Potsdam doing research in Lusatia? What are you doing there? And I think that's a very reasonable question for people who are not part of the scientific system. And that is also basically the story behind the podcast. So, yeah, we wanted to show in a low threshold and in a transparent and also somehow in an entertaining way what we had to do with whom and why in Lusatia. And yeah, so yeah, that was the story behind yeah, our podcast. And it was very important for us, especially important for us because we're a transdisciplinary project. That means we work together with, or we conducted research together with actors or stakeholders from politics and from civil society and also with youth people. And so it was important also to show their perspectives and yeah, to present the valuable perspectives of our yeah, practice partners. And yeah, it was yeah, it was also important for us. Yeah, because we work transdisciplinary and we wanted to show also the results in a transdisciplinary way. And the other aspect is that also our practice partners wanted, or they wanted to give our joint research results to their partners, and yeah, that was also a reason why we did a podcast, because their research or their partners also are part of less science-oriented groups, and it was important for us that also, we produce a low-threshold product that also less science-oriented people, have access to. And we produced, or that all resulted in 4 podcast episodes, one on civil society, one on politics and structural change, one on youth participation and the perspective of young people, and one on art and culture. And we produced the 4 episodes between August 2021 and February 2022, because it was also part of a research project. And what that listened like, I would say, we have a short listen.
Genau, Johannes ist mit dem Fahrrad bei uns vorbeigekommen auf Recherchereise. Wow, ne? Also so kann also Wissenschaft auch funktionieren und so muss die funktionieren, weil was kriegst du in Potsdam raus?
Also der Einfluss der Wissenschaften auf die Wirklichkeit, der ist da und den muss man immer ein bisschen mitbedenken, bevor man eben loslegt.
Letztendlich dient ja dieser Podcast auch mir jetzt dazu, mal zu reflektieren mit jemandem, der von außerhalb kommt und der durch seine Fragen ja auch mir hilft, mal einzuschätzen, was passiert da eigentlich gerade bei euch.
Am Ende, ich wünsche, dass nicht nur die Industrie verbessern wird, sondern die ganze Region.
Ich bin natürlich in dieses Projekt gekommen oder auch gegangen, ganz bewusst, weil ich wollte, dass wir eine Wirkung entfalten.
Also Politik kann ja auch immer nur das verändern, wo sie auch weiß, dass irgendwie so ein Unbehagen da ist. Und was wir in unserer Arbeit festgestellt haben, dass dieses Unbehagen oft überhaupt nicht bekannt ist. Es ist gar nicht klar, wo der Schuh drückt.
Or inconvenience, I'm not so sure if inconvenience is the right translation for Unbehagen, because it's such a special German word. But that was our idea when we worked together with the practice partners. We wanted to know, what do they think about the structural change? What are their perspectives? Where do they see or potential for cooperation? Where do they see potential for shaping structural change? And that was why we worked with them together. And I think transformation is also a process that dives deep into the society, and it affects so many areas of society. And so I think that having a conversation about that is quite important, and also that a lot of people can create some kind of connections to this issue. And I think podcasts somehow create some kind of informed social discourse. And I think that is why podcasting is a good way to have some kind of discussion about such transformation issues. And now, to the end, I have some critical words also, because for us as a transdisciplinary project, it was the podcast was an aspect of our transdisciplinary work, and it was an equal aspect next to journal articles or policy briefs, but not in the scientific system. So the scientific system just have a look on, or it just count how many journal articles you produce. And I think when we say that science communication is also a part of transformation, then we should think about how science communication can also be supported by the scientific system itself. So, thank you.
Thank you, Victoria. I guess this local transdisciplinary project is particularity of your podcasts, that you go to the people on the ground and interview them, and you have also worked with a journalist that went there on the ground. And I guess the work with a journalist, you share it with Claudia Kempfert's podcast that she will present now. And in her presentation, we start by giving a listen to her podcast.
ARD. MDR aktuell. Kempferts Klimapodcast. Hallo und willkommen, ich bin Markus Schödel. In diesem Podcast sprechen wir über die Klimakrise. Und zwar mit der renommierten Klimaökonomin Professorin Claudia Kempfert. Sie arbeitet am Deutschen Institut für Wirtschaftsforschung und leitet dort die Abteilung Energie, Verkehr, Umwelt. Hallo Frau Kempfert.
Hallo Herr Schödel.
Unser Thema heute ist Bauen. Die Bundesregierung hat bekannt gegeben, dass die Energiestandards für Neubauten nicht verschärft werden.
That was it. We will not listen to the whole podcast now. Although Bauen, this is building sectors, is very interesting. Now, thank you so much for also in the name of DIW for having this event here. We very much appreciate it. Also, thank you for the organizers and all the cooperation. I know there was a lot of work in the back also doing it in the Berlin Science Week. Thank you so much for having this event here. Yeah, podcast, we already heard that is a very important aspect of science communication. And I just wanted to briefly explain what Kempfert's Klima podcast is doing. As you already heard, it's the MDR, it's a Mitteldeutscher Rundfunk, it's a German public German public radio organization, which is ARD, doing this podcast, and they asked me 2 years ago, really 2 years ago, because the event was a climate conference that was in Glasgow, and they decided to talk about more the climate conferences, but also what about the scientific findings related to it. And that was the main motivation. They called me and asking whether I would be interested in doing this podcast, and I didn't think so long. I thought it's a very good way of communicating scientific findings. And the main aim of this podcast is to evaluate also political decisions. That is something special, but also to classify scientific findings and also advice on sustainable living. And this is something which is really interesting because the listeners are sending questions and we are trying to answer all of them. And we have now 50 episodes up to now, and there were 50 questions already by the listeners. If you have one, please send it to the MDR. Now, the idea is really to discuss the topics about climate policy decisions or politicians decided on different events, but also around the energy transition, about climate protection, discuss about political decisions, and look at a scientific study. And I'm not sure now the sound really is bad, right? This is something wrong. We have some interference. Yeah. Okay. So that was always my my worries that but my phone is off, so sometimes this is a reason for it. But this time I really turned it off. I'm not sure whether you can heard about what I talked about. Okay, fine. So I don't start from the very beginning. But the idea was also to discuss one scientific study, and this is what I found really interesting because this RID or the public radio is really for a broad audience, for normal people, so to say. And this normal people is always important also for the maker of this podcast at the MDR. It's still ongoing, right? Is it me who's interfering here? I have some electronic ways of intervening. Too much energy, right? There's energy coming also out of my body, probably that interferes with this, with this microphone. I hope this is fine now. So now, and also to answer questions from listeners, for the normal people, this is something which is really important, also for the making of it. And we discuss about different aspects of transformation and also about climate conferences. And now we have 2 years. We have 2 years of doing this podcast, and we are still before the next conference in Abu Dhabi, which is COP28, and this is 2 years ago. Now, and there were we started with the aim to have 4 episodes for the climate conferences, but the MDR said there are so many listeners that they want to continue it. So there is a broad interest also in these topics, and they decided to continue. Now, the question, though, that you have raised was very important. Why do we choose this kind of podcast also for the scientific output? I think it's important also for the science communication to do something like this, because podcasts right now are one important thing to reach a broad audience. And we see that we started during the Corona crisis with Drosten's podcast, as Henning already said, and we listen all of us to him, and I think it's a very important way to communicate also to the broader or general public. And this, I think, is important also to do it in that way, and to reach here also normal people. We have another podcast, though, here at DIW. Wolf-Peter Schill, Alexander Roth are sitting in the back. I don't know why, but you're sitting there. You don't see them here right now, but this is called Fossil-frei, fossil-free. Actually, I just came to the DIW here around the corner. Is an advertisement by the big utility saying we are making Berlin fossil-free. I don't know whether you have seen it already, but this reminded me really. This fossil-free podcast is a great podcast. They discuss about the DIW Ampel Monitor, which is also they look at the aim of the energy transition, about the target of the German government that set themselves on the energy transition. Also, they check if they are on track and meeting these targets, and discuss about the energy transition in this podcast fossil-free, and also the progress in the areas of renewable electricity, renewable heat, electric mobility, green hydrogen, and others. And there are 11 episodes already by now, and there's a lot of material in the Ampel Monitor in the context of the energy transition, and they are using it. Is it working now?
It's working, just in case.
Oh, sorry. Thank you for contributing. I mean, do we have to give him an applause right now, because he's you don't. You don't see it online, but he's just working like hell. He's working like hell right now because of this not working communication here right now. But we are working on it. DIW will do it. So, but now we have 2 podcasts here. I think it's a good way, and they have decided also to do it in a way in order to explain also to a broader public and audience what about the targets, what about the energy transition, and also contribute to the sustainability aspects, which is really important. And I think it's very good, and very good that we are discussing it also here today about different aspects, how to reach on different topics of sustainability. And thank you so much for being here. Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you for sharing your insights and also a bit the story of how this podcast came about. And now we pass on directly to Alex Demirovic, who will tell us about his podcast, So Long Didn't Read. Alex, you didn't bring an audio part because you said you prefer to use the time speaking to us.
Yeah,
so.
Come on, I forgot it, to tell the truth. Yeah, I mean, yeah, okay. Now, thank you for the invitation and bringing us together here for a chance to reflect on that work, producing podcasts, what is in fact really a lot of work, you know. So it's much more than I ever expected it to be, yeah. And many of the problems, or how to say, the things we have to reflect on this is exactly connected to this aspect of a lot of time and preparation work and producing it technically and so on. So, yeah, okay. So we started, first the institutional background perhaps. This is different to the institutional backgrounds you have, as already mentioned, because it's a political Stiftung, foundation. That's not a good English translation for it, because it's public money that is given to organizations that do political education. And so in our case, the Rosa Luxemburg Stiftung is close to the left party, but it's of course independent as the other Stiftung are too. And so the background is there that, of course, as in terms of political education, we thought how to intensify our political communication and the way how we organize political education, and in particular in the period of the pandemic and the lockdown period, in spring 2020, where it was really hard, of course, or impossible to bring people together, to invite them, to have public events, with talks and discussions and so on. And so we thought, perhaps podcast is a good way to substitute other forms of political communication. So we started in 2020 to think on how we can do that and what is important, what could make sense for a political organization like the Luxembourg Foundation. And there are several podcasts on history, on local policies. Recently, we started a podcast on war and peace policies. So it's a whole bunch of a range of different podcasts. And so I was asked to produce a podcast on theory, social theory. So this is my obsession with that, for decades now, and I liked very much to do that. And so it had the topic is not so much climate change or energy problems, transformations. Although we have a lot of discussions in the Stiftung on the problems of social transformation, socio-ecological transformation, also with regard to the Lausitz or other regions or industry, the car industry, what is a big issue. I mean, you are familiar with that more than me, that there's a big issue to transform the car industry in Germany, and also the energy basis of German industry should completely exchange. But so this is not exactly the field of the podcast I'm doing. What we're producing is a podcast on critical social theory, materialist theory. So to give people the concepts, the names of theories, the authors of those theories, to give you an idea. We started with, of course, in the case of Rosa Luxemburg Stiftung, we started with Rosa Luxemburg, and then we continued with Karl Marx and then Foucault and Gramsci and Nikos Poulantzas, so others who did a lot of interesting work on state theory to understand better what politics can do, what this field of state policies allows us to do and to change, and the way how we can do it in democratic terms. And so this is what we did for now. We started in March 21. We now have produced 32 episodes. The last one was on what is completely far away from the issue we're discussing here. It's on Siegfried Krakauer's film theory. But in a way, it's really fantastic, his argument, because what he thinks what film is doing, in a way, we're discussing that in terms of podcast, bringing the reality back to us. How can we conquer the reality? And I think that's such an important question. How we can conceive or grasp the reality, because so many actors in our societies are very active to hinder us to conceive the reality, to grasp it, to see what is really ongoing. I mean, the way how climate problems are discussed only as climate change. I mean, we are confronted with a catastrophe. Our societies are collapsing. It's not a climate change in a way of peaceful, change of worlds and things going on. No, it's really very hard for many people. Many people are suffering. They are endangered by death, and so I think it's too harmless, the way how these things are discussed in German debates, and the way how, we will solve it. And of course, when we follow our finance minister, everything will be solved by technological means. These are kids. This is fantasy. It has nothing to do with the reality we are living in, and so I think what is really necessary, and that's, I think, is the way how the podcast we are producing, people need theory to understand what is going on. So let me just a little remark. I'm so skeptical about the concept of narrative. The title of our podcast here or event is narration. But I think what we need is not only narratives. Of course, we need narratives. We need also concepts, ideas, how we can approach the reality, how we conceive of what is real, the conflicts, the struggles people are living in, the wars, the dangers, and the forthcoming catastrophes. And German society, as I see it, is not at all prepared for those danger and catastrophes we are confronted with in near future. So this is my view. It has nothing to do with pessimism, although I'm getting older, but maybe it's one of the reasons. But I think it's a kind of realism, to deal the problem with this. Okay. So, political education is the main aspect, materialist social theory, and to give a broad sense of what is going on. Let me just finish with one hint to what the problem is, that, in my eyes, that universities are declining in Germany and they don't offer the right knowledge for dealing with all these problems. We have the lasting problem of disciplines, and these disciplines, of course, there is a lot of discussion on interdisciplinarity or transdisciplinarity, but in fact, when you want to apply for money, you have to go to these foundations that give you the money, and then they ask you for your professional background, and then it's sociology and biology and political science and so on, and then you have to fall back into the roots or the modes of your research as you do it for long. And so materialist theory is not very much taught in German universities. In my eyes, critical theory, people are not familiar with this. It's more or less mainstream knowledge. And when you think of, with regard to the problems we are discussing here, I would say what we need is a complete new shape of knowledge. I think in what I'm interested in is what people like Donna Haraway did, or Jason Moore, this kind of chaos, or Thuluzen. So bring together different forms of knowledge to understand what they would call a web of life, that brings together the economy, the technology, the biology, that means the spheres of different livelihoods, and the way how we live with these different fields. So and there is no place, as I see it, as universities are developing now, I don't see that there is a place for such a shape of or reshaping knowledge we need to handle with, or to approach to all the problems we have to do with. Okay, so far. Yeah, let me add one remark. Is the time enough? Yeah.
One remark more.
Okay, one remark more. No, I mean, I found the introduction very interesting, and also your remarks on the way how you have contact with the listeners, the people who listen the podcast. I find it in a way true what people like Bert Brecht and others, Hans Magnus Enzberger, gave us as a hint when they reflected on radio. The problem is, in my eyes, is that is a one-directional medium. Yeah, I can prepare myself and I can give a kind of a lecture. I speak 30 minutes on a theory, and then I have a guest in the studio, and we talk about the context and the person of the theorist, and so we do all this, but it's always us that is doing, and we hope that people will listen. I can assure you that there are many people, who like to listen to it, but there is only little reaction to it. And this is for me, so we know that people write us emails, please produce a podcast to that person or that person, and so the list of theorists is long and is getting longer. It's now about 100 persons. Yeah, we can present there in a podcast, but I think, but it's no reaction in the way, this is convincing, or that was too difficult. And so sometimes people, even on the street, they say, it's a wonderful podcast, but this time it was too difficult. So I was really surprised, but it's not a systematic reaction. So this is, I think, I'm missing a little bit. Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you very much for presenting. And maybe a small applause in the meantime. I have to say, I told you in the previous talk that to some podcasts I can listen while I'm cooking or maybe even while I'm riding my bike or so. But your podcast, I have to sit and pay attention because it's very, apart from being very interesting, there's so much that I take away from it and from the complexity, and that's why it's called Too Long Didn't Read, because you present books that are long, that are for some people too long to read. And you put it concentrated. And now we've already heard 3 presentations. There's one more. And I want to tell you that in the invitation text, there are the links to the podcast. So for everyone who wants to follow them. And also here, we have some flyers there and some QR codes. So everybody who's in the room can also pass by there afterwards. So you can all have a listen to the podcast that maybe you haven't listened to before. And now we come to Cecilia to present your podcast.
Thank you so much. And in fact, I'm going to present our podcast, because Alexander and I, we work together in this podcast, not just the two of us, but we are a gang that work together, and it makes the thing much, much better. And I'm not here just to present our podcast, but also to celebrate. But that I will share with you a little bit in the end of this input. And thank you that you haven't brought the sample, because now I'm so curious about this podcast. That was wonderful. It's very nice to talk after you, because I think our podcasts relate somehow. So Carbon Critique is a podcast about climate change politics and democracy. And one thing that we were talking here is how to make podcasts besides academic work. And it's exactly how we started. We were starting our research group that's called EcoPol, that's easier than Democratic Governance for Ecopolitical Transformations. So our nickname is EcoPol. And starting this new research group, we decided to then have a podcast and work together in this podcast. And for maybe summarize or an overview of what we decide to achieve. It's a mix of a simple idea with a huge goal. Like in the Berlin Science Week, I think the catchphrase is dare to know, no? So we dare to dream and think really huge with this podcast. So the simple idea of this podcast is that it's a podcast about books. It's a podcast that is an interview. So we decide specific books that is related with our theme. We invite the guests and you have an interview. I think this is a simple format. But then comes the huge goal that I was talking about. And maybe with that, we can go for film that you just mentioned. Like, for example, you have watched Matrix, right? Many of you have watched Matrix. If you have not, House of Cabana. 20 years old are you? So, yes. So, do you remember the pills? Yeah. So this is our big goal. After you listen to our podcast, I'm sure that you're not going to be the same, or at least it's our goal. Because we really work hard. We try to find these authors, these books that are, for us, at least as researchers and doing podcasts as podcasting research practice, dissonant voices that really challenges common, ordinary narratives that can really disturb us and think in climate change, in theory, in a different way. So then I can give you some examples of the kind of questions that these episodes bring to us. Like, for example, one question. How did energy come to mean fuel in politics? How can we take a feminist and critical look at energy? If this is a question for you, episode 1. Cara Daggett, fellow at the Institute right now. Yes, with Birth of Politics. Or another question, how to reflect on resistance today in times of extreme right and green capitalism? Episode 3, Maurizio Lazzarato. So these are the voices that impact, transform our lenses, challenging certain narratives. So with them, we want to disturb a bit. It's not that you need to agree with these people, but I really hope that everyone listen to this kind of podcast or episodes or this crafting work that we do together can really think in a different way. And one maybe last element before you have a hint, a sample of this podcast, and I would like to highlight. If you came here today, think of maybe starting a podcast and is a bit dismotivated because, okay, maybe I need lots of money, how to do that. I have a very good news for you. The thing that you need is a network. Maybe business people would say network. I would say friends and colleagues. And that's really what made the difference for our podcast. Like, for example, one very important person that was the godmother of this podcast is the journalist Anja Krieger, that is here. We invited, but I didn't know that she would come, but thank you. And she was the one that really gave us the baby steps, like how to craft, how to understand what are the milestones to create the podcast. And with all this knowledge, then we went crazy. We start to think about the title, the logo. We had a Brazilian musician from film. Also, he produced the songs of the film Bacurau, another movie to your list. Yes, and craft something specially for us. We went through the books. We put our own research questions for this kind of preparation of the interviews. We went and invited our guests, and they accepted. So that was a very big journey, and we do pre-production, post-production, all together as our research practice, because we are intellectuals that are really trying to do something with everyday life. The theory that we study and the things that we study has to do something with our life. And it's our way of moving, or maybe even producing resistance, and also maybe fighting with this academia that sometimes is so hard for especially young women with their families and sometimes the precarization of the academic work. And here are we talking about podcasts. So it's also something to celebrate. So now I invite you to listen a little bit to a sample, and I hope that you can identify some of these elements with this sample of the Carbon Critique podcast.
democracy, we're part of it. It's not just something that afflicts people in producer states. Thinking about the kind of way of understanding capitalism that came into being at the same time as development came into being is, I think, very important. So then when you get to the Sustainable Development Goals and the Millennium Development Goals, you've obviously tried to patch up this rather ugly thing called development and improve it with new kinds of measures that take account of basic issues of health and literacy and so on. But you're still stuck within this rubric of growth, of what matters is development.
Carbon Critic, a podcast from the Institute for Advanced Sustainability Studies. For the Democratic Governance for Ecopolitical Transformations Research Group. Our starting point is to think of carbon emissions not as a simple chemical effect, but as a political component of our times. On today's episode, we will bring to you one of the most influential authors to our research, Professor Timothy Mitchell, or Tim, as he kindly presented himself to us. Tim is a political science professor at the Department of Middle Eastern, South Asian, and African Studies at Columbia University. His areas of interest include colonialism, political economy, the politics of energy, and the making of expert knowledge. Much of his work blends the study of the built world, technical devices, ecological processes, and the history of economic and political concepts. We will talk to him about his classic book, Carbon Democracy, Political Power in the Age of Oil.
So thank you so much. And now the celebration that I started this talk and was inviting you. It's because today we are launching our website. It is not just because it's a website. It's because in the website also it's a kind of digital platform that we are used to overcome one element that we were struggling with. That is like how to bring different voices. That is not just in English, for example, but different authors that are in the Global South, the so-called Global South, or publishing different languages. And then in the website, you have all the transcripts, because these interviews, it's also a material that we hope that our listeners can use in their classes, can maybe cite in their papers, or can make alive of something different from our conversations in the audio, but also a different way of achieving in English or in German or original language. And also there is some behind the scenes that is not very matrix, but you see that in fact what is more important is to have this network that will make the thing happen. So I invite you to check the website, and thank you so much for the attention. Thank you.
Thank you, Cecilia. So, thank you all for your very interesting and insightful presentations. And I think what you can see is that we have a big range of difference also between the podcasts, which are all scientific podcasts done by scientists, but in very different settings. So I guess that's very interesting. Does any one of you have a direct comment to the presentation? Because otherwise I have some questions presented for you. So maybe we can go in the same order. So I start with you, Victoria. And I think you raised a very important point that everyone sort of has agreed to, which is the challenge of how scientists can find the time and also the recognition for science communication projects that are outside this obligations of the classical scientific output. So I wanted to ask you about your podcast, how much work was involved in it? Like, can you maybe give us this short, small look behind the scenes of how it was for you? And also, I'm wondering, your first episode starts with a journalist who goes to the field and interviews people, calling you. And he said, Okay, so I'm totally free of like asking and raising critical points. So maybe you can also share what was that like to have someone of outside your project, like going to speak in the field with the people and also picking up critical voices from there.
Yeah, maybe I start with your second question. Yeah, because that was an experiment for us. Because I don't know if you work together with journalists, maybe that can also be quite hard because they pick up the stuff in the wrong manner. So yeah, but it worked quite well in our case. And it was, I would say, Jan Schilling was the journalist and he also produced with us together the podcast. And it was quite interesting because he was some kind of a mediator between our the people in the field or our practice partners and us. And it was some kind of a reflection for us that he asked the people in the field how they felt about working with us. And that was so interesting because it was also for us material to reflect on our transdisciplinary approach. So the podcast was not only a form of science communication, it created also research results on how transdisciplinary approaches are perceived by the field. So that was also quite interesting for us, to have a journalist on our side. Also because a journalist, they ask questions in another way than scientists. And this was also, I think that was a quite interesting approach for us. And your first questions on how much work it was, it is, Alex already said it is a lot of work. And I didn't expect that it is so much work, actually. And we already cooperated with the journalists, and he supported us a lot, and he also created a lot of this technical aspects. But I mean, it was a lot of weeks. Yeah.
Great. Wonderful. Thank you. So now to you. I was now, when Alex mentioned the topic of how in the media, in the mainstream media, like the grade of the catastrophe is not reflected, I immediately, and then we come back to film, I think of the Don't Look Up movie, where you have scientists screaming about the Earth being soon destroyed, well, in that case, of a different thing, which is an asteroid coming to the Earth. And nobody reacts, and he's being ignored. And of course, I wanted to ask you, you told us that you were invited in the context of the COP conferences, but also you have like a media presence, like in TV. Also, you write books that are perceived outside the scientific bubble. Why do you do a podcast? Is that also like for getting beyond like being in a talk show where like journalists maybe sometimes ask questions in different ways, or where you have a very short limit and to set your own topics on the agenda? Is that part of the motivation?
Well, that's one reason, exactly as you just said, that in the podcast you have much more time in discussing also scientific findings, in providing also scientific insights, going in depth. And I think the Kempfert's Klima podcast, I had the big luck that the editorial team allowed for more time, because as you exactly just said, is about that journalists want to have it short because they fear that they are losing listeners. And I try to explain that they could gain more listeners if we do it longer. And that was at the very beginning really a big discussion about, and this is, I mean, talk shows, you cannot explain anything. I mean, look at the talk shows. We don't talk about talk shows here right now, but this is an own, that needs to have an own discussion, podium discussion like this, but they're too short. I mean, they're just focusing on political aspects and shouting at each other, and they do not really provide insights. They are not there to provide insights. And in podcasts, you can provide scientific insights. It's to just explain. I mean, look at the different podcasts, and they're all about to provide scientific insights. And it's not only Kempfert's Klima podcast, also Fossil-Free podcast. You provide scientific insights and go in depth studies. You said books, but we do studies and answer also to listener questions in order to get a feedback also here. And the interesting thing was, as I initially said, they decided to have 4 episodes because they thought we'd just do it around COP. And they figured out that there was a big interest by the audience and also the feedback they got. I mean, I think the MDR is the Mitteldeutscher Rundfunk. They have now around 30 podcasts. I just looked at the webpage. They might have more. But we are one of many, and they are growing. And the reason is the people listen to it. And the more they go in depth, and they have different topics like whatever. I mean, crime, true crime, and whatever. And they are increasing. And the scientific topics, it's really of interest. But, however, the editorial team told me in advance also to this discussion that they have discussions about the content of this podcast because in the media, as you already said, the journalists need to listen to one and an opposite opinion, they call it all the time. And I always explain where science is not an opinion, it's a scientific finding. You can have a scientific discussion about it and discuss about whatever, what the finding is and what my impression is of how the political decisions have been made, but not about a different opinion on the scientific study. So this was really a progress to discuss with them because Wissenschaft ist keine Meinung, and they call it always Meinung. I just now come into German. It's called science is not an opinion, and but there's always a discussion like this. And they told me also in their round where they discuss about the podcast, I always get the feedback where we need to get another opinion about it. So I always said, okay, then we have to change the topic or how we do it, because in the case that we do scientific assessment, we cannot do it in that way, but we could invite guests, of course, and discuss about the topics and how they see it and have. But that's a different aim of a podcast. And now they also explain that because we have to reach normal people and we have to make it as understandable as possible. And sometimes they discuss about how deep they can go into it because they are climate activists who have more, they are reaching us and saying, well, you have to do it in a more in-depth way. And they are normal people. They are calling and saying, well, that was too complicated. And so we always have to find a balance between the two. And I think it's a different audience than you're describing, because we are in the public radio world, which has different ways of organizing this. But in advance, they told me that, and they also in the very beginning they had the fear that at a certain point in time they would say everything would have been said about the climate change. And I always said, well, you never can have that point in science. You can always talk about current studies. There are always coming more studies. Science is working in a way that there are always more studies, and we can discuss about it. And that was also progress. But now they're very happy with this and have discussions internally about how to do it. But because the listeners, we have so many listeners, and there's a broad listener audience, and this is what they did not expect at the very beginning, and that was I found very interesting because they said 4 episodes is enough, and now we are at 50 and we are still continuing, and they say that's always good. But the one point was indeed the interconnection with the listeners. That is what you also said. It's not a one-way direction, and we have the option really to also interact with listeners. But journalists are ticking in a different way than scientists, and this is always what we have to balance out, and it's a good way. And I'm really happy that the public radio is offering these kind of podcasts independently of the topic, that science can be present there.
Wonderful. Yeah. Definitely, it's a totally different setting where you have a lot more freedom, and then we come now next again to Alex Demirovic, and you said that one of your ideas of the podcast is political education. I find that very interesting, and like political education, I also mentioned this in a classroom where you get direct feedback. But I imagine that is a challenge for you. But anyway, I would like to ask you, like how, when you are like through the foundation closer to social movements or also to the political party, do you get like feedback there that you maybe incited new thoughts with your podcasts, or do you get that kind of feedback? And also, I wanted to mention that the structure of your podcast, or the episodes that I have listened to, is that in the first part you present the biography and the content of the book and the story context, etc. And in the second part you have an interview partner, usually a person who has written a book about that person that you present, and there you have this opportunity to relate like a classic book to current developments as well, which I find very interesting. And I guess that also then feeds back into your own research work. Is that the case? Like in the way that Cecilia also mentioned that we are doing in our podcast, like we invite authors not just so they can present their work, but also they inspire us, and we ask them questions that are part of what we are researching on right now. Is that something interesting that happens to you as well?
Sure. Yeah, many aspects. Yeah, the idea of political education is, in my eyes, it means that we give people an idea that there are ongoing debates since decades. It's so that materialist theory on state, on ecology, on gender relations, on the way how domination works, is something that has to be continued, and and there is some kind of elaboration on the different aspects of those theoretical approaches. And there is, I already mentioned it, there is little feedback. But what I found interesting, that students told me that they proposed to their professors to take into account or to bring in the podcasts to enrich the stuff of the seminars, and I found that really funny. Yeah, so they think, it's worth to integrate a podcast on Stuart Hall in question in a seminar on racism, or whatsoever, or to see that Haraway is worth to be discussed. There are so many effects against Donna Haraway, because sometimes it sounds a little bit weird, with speaking of this kind of, I don't know. I mean, the Thuluzen, this. I don't have the English words for all this. This kind of close to the earth and dirtiness and so on, and the wet but she is so in favor for that, and to bring in the ideas of networks of different lives. And I think for some people who have in mind that materialism means economy, hard material, and whatever means economy. Money is very fluid. I mean, food has to be produced from different materials and so on. So what means materialism is, I think, the conception of that is changing. The guests I am inviting, I find it very interesting, your argument on opinions. I hate the word opinion.
Really?
Because, I mean, yes, this is a pseudo-democratic attitude.
Yes.
And, I mean, you can... when you think of how opinion is brought into the political debate during the last years, that means all the knowledge about climate change, the greenhouse effect, and so on and so on. All this, only your opinion, my opinion. My 92 years old mother says, yeah, it's your opinion. The climate is always changing. I said, how do you know that? Yeah, you have nothing to do with climate research, and you are so suspicious on those people who do this for years and years and live on the North Pole to follow the ways how the climate is developing. Yeah, they know nothing. You know, this is the way how people react. Yeah,
no, but also, sorry to interfere.
No,
but it's really because how media works.
Yeah,
and
exactly.
this is why I said it.
Yeah.
And this is we are in the world of don't look up, because it's just an opinion. Is what media trains people to think. There's you with your opinion and another one. But climate change is not an opinion. The facts, the scientific facts of climate change is not an opinion. But this is really a point where I also have discussions with the journalists all the time.
No, and we can see that. I mean, this way of how our society becomes more and more a talk show format. Yeah, I mean, not to speak of Markus Lanz, who is one of the most terrible things that happened to us. Yeah, I mean,
this is what you said.
Yeah, no, sure. I allow myself to do that. Yeah, no, yeah, it's my opinion. Yeah. So okay, yeah. So and I mean, to say it again, it's so much work. I mean, it takes me, I think, about a week to prepare myself and to be aware of the problems, and then in a way, I feel completely underprepared when I go to the studio. And then the guest, I mean, this is so interesting that I invite the people to not to have another opinion, but to open up the way how we can see a book or a theory and the concepts, and to enlarge the field of understanding the concepts. Yeah, so it's not the way how my opinion when I present the book and his or her opinion, but to enrich the way how we can deal with the concepts that these are elaborated in the book. May I say a word to this problem of podcasts in general? Because going back to your...
I'd like to ask it to be short, but...
Yeah, very short. Yeah. No, I think also when Henning was introducing the idea of podcasts, I thought we have to be aware that it's a rather new development, and more people are producing podcasts, and so it becomes a new battleground for political debates. I mean, it's not something that is in itself free or helpful or enlightening or making political education, but we will have also at a certain point have podcasts that are going the other way around, you know, and take another turn. And then I think it's what is happening also with newspapers and TV and so on, that we have the same conflicts, the same struggles on the field, on the terrain of podcasts too. Yeah, this is, I think, an interesting point, and and also and that has even some impact on the way how it is used in the universities. Yeah, that of course some professors feel under pressure to integrate the podcast, but they don't like it so much, you know. And I mean, it's not that what they want to do. Yeah. Okay.
Okay, so now I have one more question for Cecilia, but I already announced that we will then open up for like 2 or 3 questions from the audience. So you may already think if you have...
Just 2?
if you have a question.
Or you can open up also.
But I wanted to ask you something.
Okay. So you ask and open, and then I have time to think.
Yeah, maybe we add my question to the question from the audience. So what I wanted to ask you is that in your podcast or in our podcast, one of the first questions usually is to ask the person about the personal story behind the book, like what inspired you to research this topic from their point of view, which is something that is rarely addressed in a scientific paper. Like, of course, you do your literature review, but not this personal story behind this. So I'm wondering, like, why do you choose to speak about this in a podcast, and why is a podcast a good tool for that? But that can be one of more questions from the audience. So do we have people in the audience who want to say something? Yes, here in the second row already. Maybe you present yourself briefly.
Hi, I'm Camilla Nabieva. I work at Helmholtz Klimainitiative, Climate Initiative. And thanks a lot for your presentations. Some of you mentioned some of the things that I'm going to ask, but I'd like to ask you to speak a little bit more about the target audiences and how you reached out to them. So how did you define them while developing the podcast, and which channels and platforms proved to be especially successful in reaching out to these audiences? And I'm especially interested in whether you succeeded to reach out to people who actually not usual podcast listeners and not in scientific community. So what was especially successful in reaching out to them? Thanks.
Thank you. Here's the question in the second row. And then it's you.
Thanks. My name is Niklas Schäffer, and I actually also used to work at the RIFS and the Ecopol group, and was also engaged in the creation of the Carbon Critique podcast. My question would go to Alex and Cecilia, as you both engage with books in political theory. And my question would be, in how far, what is your estimation, encourages your podcast actually for people to read these books? Because maybe I'm a little bit like cultural pessimistic here. I have the feeling, like also as someone who just graduated in political science, that there's a high interest in political theory, but there's not so much really the engagement with books and political texts, and that like maybe like sometimes for people it's easier to listen to the summary of Alex, how he talks about, I don't know, like Rosa Luxemburg or something, than really take the bravery and the courage to read like a 500-page book. Yeah, that's my question.
Interesting. And then we had one more question here again in the second row, and then we would come to a round of answers. So, yeah.
Hi, my name is Annika Weber. I work at the Institute for Climate Protection, Energy and Mobility here in Berlin. And I have a background in global studies. So I was very happy to see that there is the Carbon Critique podcast present today. And my question is, if we agree that transformation has to be looked at from a holistic perspective, what responsibilities do podcasts have to represent a diverse set of views? And how do you ensure that you don't only reproduce Eurocentric ideas? And is that the task of every podcast or just a few? Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, so maybe to summarize, we had one question about the target audiences, and then now also a question about who is being presented in the podcasts, about do people still read books or do they prefer to listen to the summary, and also the question to Cecilia about asking about the personal story behind the books. Maybe Cecilia, we start with you and we go backwards then?
Yes. So about the person, the behind the scenes and the books. I think all of us here had the experience of write something. And then we have the result. A paper, a book, or something like that. But it's very hard to include all the side stories, or because I think everything that we put ourselves, it's very, very much populated. There is a history also that sheds light on the specific struggle that you were involved to write a specific thing. And then the authors that the idea is that once that you have the author, like bringing all these populated or side stories to his book, we can access why they were thinking about that. What was the hook that made that person really embrace the very difficult task of writing a book in times of internet, podcasts, and things that are so like in social media. A book is something that you really need to put yourself out. And it's even like one difficult, for example, that we have in the podcast is to find women publishing with these critical takes on climate. Because it's something that also, maybe going to your question, the holistics also in the combining, because we try first to have balance, like gender balance. We really want women there also with their books and their work that we can show in the podcast. But also one difficulty is like to overcome English. Like I'm a Brazilian with this English accent running a podcast together with my colleagues, also international. So it's already a challenge. They need to get used with my accent. Sorry, but it's an invitation because all of us are under the same pressure that even my German colleagues sometimes say that they don't publish anymore in German because they need to publish in English. And then when we talk, for example, it's one wish that we have for the next season is to invite indigenous authors, for example. We have plenty. We have people like publishing in Spanish or their own language that we would love to bring. And that's why the website, for example, was our maybe shortcut to maybe bring more accessible this kind of knowledge that people at least can read and can reproduce and can listen also. Because if one example, we had Maurizio Lazzarato, that is French, that is Italian, but based in France, and the interview was in French. And then we had a voice-over version. And in fact, the version in French has much more like access than the one that we translated. And I love that. This is really good. Really need to create like different sounds that also decolonize a little bit the way that we produce knowledge. So, and then for the target audience, indeed was one of the elements that our consultant helped us to think about it. And I think you are the audience that we want to achieve. Are people like working already with a climate or activists or people in the movements? And then like maybe they will not read the entire book. That goes to the question of Niklas. But I think at least they will have the access. And at some point, maybe in their lives, they will remember that specific book or knowledge that they can, again, consult and look for it. We don't think that we make the people read everything. But one feedback, for example, that we got like, oh, such a great episode. I bought the book because it was really good. Or somebody else like, your brainy podcast. You come with these very complex ideas, but it's so nice to listen to these authors, like while I'm cooking or having a glass of wine. So these are really good feedback that I think we say, yeah, we managed, we achieved what we wanted.
Thank you. Maybe we keep actually the order of speaking. So Victoria, you would be next. And actually, we would already, like with this round, be closing the panel. So make sure you mention everything you want to mention, but in a rather short way.
Okay, then I'm going to answer one question, the question on the audience, because I think that's how you target the audience. It's not easy, and it's very special when you're designing the format of your podcast. And when we thought about our format, it was also the point where we thought a lot about. And we defined it actually with our practice partners together, because we thought, okay, what kind of communities are working our practice partners with, and who could be interested in this podcast. And then we thought about how can we build up some kind of snowball system that our practice partners just gave the podcast to their partners, and then we create some kind of snowball system. And that was our way to define our audience. And also, another aspect is that mostly people around 16 to 40 hear podcasts. So it's that is the main audience. So so it's also a generational question actually, and another aspect I would like to mention, but that's also my last aspect, is that when you invite special people, you can also create and broaden your audience. So when people feel represented in a format by having, feeling that there are people there from their bubbles, you can create audience, and that's also an active way of doing that. And I think maybe that's also part of this question on the diverse views, and I think it's also important to think about which views are underrepresented and how can we integrate them in our discourse. And I think that's also should also be part of science to think about that, or of science communication.
Yeah, I mean, as I already said, the target group of the EMDR was the normal people, and they have reached it, I think, and I didn't get the most recent numbers, and I'm not sure whether they really assess of how old the people are who are listeners. I think the RID is such a broad radio station that they have all different kind of listeners, and the feedback I've got is that there are growing numbers of listeners. And some episodes, of course, have more listeners because it depends on the headline. It always depends on the topic, and then others. And I think they have reached their target, that the normal people have been reached. I wanted to make one aspect what you raised in the very beginning, just because we have the final round now, is how science communication is valued by science. Because this is a topic that we have to talk about. I mean, we are here at the DIW, who is doing a lot on scientific communication, by the DIW Wochenbericht, by this kind of offering platforms of also streaming and all the rest, and doing much more than universities are doing. But the workload that you are reporting also is a lot for these kind of podcasts, but it's also for writing weekly reports at the DIW, and we have to find a way of valuing it, because right now it's not at all. In the contrast, science is just the numbers. Yeah, okay, I have to change it again. Sorry. So science is always valuing scientific publications, and that's basically almost all. Here at the Institute, I think it's Helmholtz has the same, and others, where you have a broader way of valuing science. But usually at universities is not valued at all, and this needs to be changed, because we see that there are so many listeners, and this really makes fun, as we heard here also, and it's important because all of you are contributing to scientific communication, which is a part of democracy. And in these days where we have the other, also disturbing voices of trying to disturb and also attack democracy, scientific contributions and scientific findings are important more than ever to take place in the broader public, but also to take place everywhere, because science is one part of the democracy. And it's really, really important that we speak up and explain our scientific knowledge in these days where others are trying to attack it and also to diminish it. And that was my point here, which is really important because I really appreciate all the effort then all of you are doing to contribute to podcasts, but also contributing to this really important value, which is democracy.
Very important, for sure.
Okay, I want to take up two aspects of the questions. The first is that my experience is that the listeners, the people who listen to the podcast, some of them are really inspired to read the books themselves and even found working groups to read it together with others. And that was really a very good experience to hear that. Yeah, that it is really inspiring people to become curious, to know more about it, to know it better, to understand the the book or the theory, the theoretical background much better. So for that reason, we just concentrate on books that have a German background or are translated into German. That is a condition, how to say, that people can just buy it or find the book, and read it. So it's an easy access to the books. But that means for us it takes long discussions with regard to your question, the Eurocentrism, long debates in what the succession and who is integrated into the whole list of theorists, and so of course we always try to bring in intersectional terms, so to speak, feminist and queer theory, post-colonial theory. So what I did was a podcast on Frantz Fanon, on bell hooks. So I have the idea to bring in Mariátegui, a guy from Peru, a Marxist from the 20s, or so others from the formerly called third world theorists. So that's the way how we try to broaden the idea of what materialist theory is and what should be included. And also I did a podcast on Donna Haraway. I mean, so to give you an idea that it's really broad and to integrate these different fields of expertise and knowledge and political engagements and struggles. What else can we do? I mean, and it's not easy. I mean, to tell you, I mean, the problem is, of course, when you think of Latin America is for us easier to find the books than Africa. Mm-hmm. I mean, or South Asia. I mean, when you speak of theorists in a materialist tradition, Japan is very easy. There are a lot of people doing this kind of work, but nothing is translated. Into German. I mean, it's really hard work for those scholars who do this kind of work to translate these books, or how to say, Southeast Asia and so on. So that's really a difficulty we are confronted with.
Thank you very much. So I guess also Claudia Kempfert mentioned very, very well that this is a great contribution that's being done with the scientific podcasts, not just to science and science communication, but also to democracy. So thank you very much for doing this, for taking your time and letting me listen to your podcast, and also a great audience that you have. And so we are going to close this panel. I think we could go on for a lot more. There are many more interesting questions to discuss. I want to thank, the DIW for hosting this event, the Berlin Science Week, the technical crew that's supporting us, that's doing the live transmission to the screen. The video will be uploaded to YouTube, so you will also be able to watch it later or recommend it to other people that might be interested. Thank you to the speakers, and thank you to the audience.